should have been recording that.
I don't think my hands are sweaty. Well, now they're sweaty because you started recording and now I'm nervous.
Well, stop it. Just start. What are we doing here? What is the purpose? What is life?
You wanna give us a little, mouse trumpet introduction?
Welcome to the podcast. I'm not even the host.
I'm the host. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first episode of a 4-part series, al-Andalus, at the intersection of music and myth.
Ooh.
I know, super dramatic. I'm Lauren Buss. I'll be your actual host, although Moriah may steal the show, and joining me is my colleague and friend, Moriah Jensen. She's here to listen and learn alongside all of you, and whether she knows it or not, provide some comedic relief.
Oh, no pressure.
So make your jokes good.
Okay. They're always good.
You're right. For a little bit of context into what this project is about, we are both currently taking a class at Gustavus Adolphus College. We are senior music education majors, taking Western Music History 1 right now. And as part of this class, we are tasked with coming up with a research project, except it's not quite the same as a normal class's research paper and, academic writing and things like that, hence the format of a podcast. Moriah, would you like to talk a little bit about your own project?
I did mine as like a journal from a time traveler, so it was more creative writing than academic writing, which was really fun, and that was the most exciting part, was like coming up with the creative aspects, so...
And what's yours about?
Oh,
you can put a plug. Maybe I'll put a link in the description to your project.
There's a YouTube video, a PDF, and a Prezi online presentation about the musical rebellion of nuns in Italy during the 16th and 17th centuries. There definitely was arson involved, and boy, do I have books about all the things these nuns did. They're pretty cool. But yeah, so I have that as my project.
Personally, the arson is my favorite part. And so it's more of an accessible format to a general audience instead of, just to our classmates or people who know all about Western classical music, already. So for this project, before we get started, before we dive into the nitty-gritty, we are going to do our first shout-out. Moriah, who would you like to shout out today?
Gosh. I would like to shout out the Nobel Science Building Turtles for giving all of the music ed majors, and just music history students in general, so much joy when we come to class and out of class, because without those turtles, I don't know where any of us would be.
Very grateful. Very grateful for them. Thank you for that. So now diving into the serious stuff. So... when we got this project, I had a few ideas bouncing around my head, but I didn't really know what I wanted to dive into.
There's a lot that you could choose.
Just talk about any era from, ancient Greece to Bach. There's a couple things that happened.
just a few.
Just a few. So and then as we were talking about medieval Western music history, I thought about this Spanish class that I took two years ago.
Yeah, you're a senior, so.
Oh, I'm old. Two years ago, when I was a Spanish minor, it didn't pan out, but there was effort to be a Spanish minor in there. So in that class, it was called The Faces of Spain, and we learned a lot about the history of, the area that we now know as Spain and Portugal, which is just called, the blanket term is the Iberian Peninsula. So that entire peninsula, you'll hear that word a lot. Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal, and maybe dips a little bit into France, but you get the idea. And we learned all the way back into medieval times, up to present day. We learned about how, and I had no idea about this from any of my K-12 schooling, that there were actually Germanic Christian tribes with the Visigothic kingdom in the peninsula.
I've never heard that term before.
Oh, but wait, there's more. And they lived there for several centuries, starting in the 5th century, until they were conquered by Arabic Muslims from the Umayyad dynasty.
Ooh.
Coming up from North Africa, and And the Visigothic kingdom was there for, several centuries. And then all of a sudden, in the span of, less than 5 years, that entire peninsula was conquered because, they had, like, a weak system. And then that new reign was there for, what are my notes here? Over 300 years.
Oh, my goodness. That's
so
a long time.
I had no idea that, like, that had even happened.
Yeah, my knowledge of that time period and that area is so limited,
right.
so I had no idea.
Because anytime we talk about, like, European history, it's like World War I, World War II, right. Or like France and Italy.
Or like England, boop, boop, boop,
right, right. Whereas Spain is part of Western Europe. So I was thinking about this and realizing that not only was that not present in any of my, like, schooling before this, but it wasn't in our history textbook, even though we were talking about Western European music.
Yeah.
During this time period.
Yeah. Why wouldn't that be included?
Right. It didn't mention 300 years of people. That's a little bit of time of people living in that area. And I'll introduce another term here. So that dynasty, when it conquered into the Iberian Peninsula, that area was then known as al-Andalus, hence the name for this podcast.
Okay.
And it was just totally ignored in our readings. And I thought, there's no way that this had no impact on anything that we're learning right now.
Because, like, we talked about Spain and, like, the New World colonies and stuff like that later, but,
But not during this time. We only talked about Spain when it was, like, Christian Spain.
Right.
Or, like, previously we talked about, like, Roman Spain, which was before the Visigothic kingdom, you know. So there's just this gap of time when there was a totally different group of people living there. And I did a little bit of research. Yes. And I found out that it's actually a really highly debated topic. So I knew it would be perfect for my project. And there's
you love debate?
Right, yeah. I'm a really confrontational person. No, just because, like, it's interesting to uncover these things that some people are trying to, say don't exist, and some people are like, look at all this evidence that we have. So there's...
Well, how dare we admit that we got something wrong?
Right, right. Right. And when I looked at these research materials, I found that there are two camps in, like, academia, like music history scholars. One camp says that, of course, these people on Andalus had an impact on Western music history. They were literally right there in Western Europe.
Yeah.
Like, how would they not? And they just kind of take it for granted and speak of it as fact. And then there's a whole other camp that completely ignores that and says, no, all, like, the French tradition and the English tradition and the Italian tradition of music developed completely insulated from that area.
Interesting.
Which are two very polar opposites.
Yes.
Right? There's not, like, a lot of middle ground. You either accept that it's fact or you say, it doesn't even exist.
Oh, damn.
So, and there's a few different reasons for this lack of consensus that I've found. There's not a lack of evidence until recent years,
Sure.
It was a long time ago. So they're still, like, trying to translate resources and things like that. But also, what comes into the question is bias, which you were kind of hinting at earlier, you know. And the idea that we've been exploring a lot in our class is that history is not just fact. It's not unbiased, right? It's written by the victors, as we've talked about in class, and whoever has the most power gets to decide how history is written down.
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a quote from this text I was reading called Islamic and Christian Spain in the Early Middle Ages, which is very applicable.
Yeah, very much.
By Thomas Glick. And it says, long after the enemy was vanquished, and the enemy here referring to from the Christian perspective of, al-Andalus being reconquered eventually by Christian nations from the north. Long after the enemy was vanquished, the Jews expelled, and the Inquisition disbanded, the image of the Moor, referring to the Muslims of Spain, remained as the quintessential stranger, an object to be feared. Case histories and recent Spanish clinical psychology bear out this contention. transposed into the historiographical field subconscious. No, big word.
That's a huge word. Say that again.
Transposed. You just want me to mispronounce it.
No.
I said it right. Transposed into the historiographical field, subconscious fears became transferred into bias that underlies historical interpretation and contributes to misinterpretation.
Wow.
So essentially, what that author's getting at is that, because it was so, heated, there were wars and the reconquering of Spain by the Christians, and they became the victors and got to rewrite history however they wanted to write it. And so there's still a bias inherent in how we approach this history because of that bias that was in place then against these groups of people. And it just leads to, misinterpretation of materials and blatant rejection that certain evidence exists because of that bias that's, ingrained into the psyche. And it talks about, clinical psychology, studies that have been done show that this is still a thing today.
Wow.
And, it's a sort of othering, we don't want these people to be associated with our music, so we're just going to say that it doesn't happen.
Sure.
So that's...
That never happens in Western
No,
music history.
Absolutely not. We haven't talked about that all the time in a class at all. And I mean, that kind of, the whole victors concept comes up in your research, too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it happens with, there were all these prominent female composers that lived in convents, but because they lived in convents, that deemed them unworthy to be published or heard publicly, and so they were oppressed and their music was oppressed, but they found those ways around it. So,
right.
So yeah, that because you're a woman or because you're a person of color, your music must be inherently not as good as someone who's maybe male or white.
Right. And it's just, even if their music had contributions to what we, hold to as our musical tradition, a lot of times it's not acknowledged or actively hidden. Yeah. In some instances.
God forbid my music be influenced by anybody else.
Right.
I am the genius.
Right. So that's really what I wanted to dive into here and see for myself, what evidence I could pull out from a lot of different sources. And eventually I came to the conclusion that my argument is that al-Andalus definitely did leaving a lasting impact on the Western classical music tradition. Taking into account this new evidence that has been found in recent decades. I won't spoil it yet. Gotta save that for later.
Spoilers.
And we're gonna do some investigation.
Oh, dang. Do I get to be Sherlock or Holmes?
Both. You're the one who's watched the shows.
I'm gonna have an identity crisis.
And then, I was also thinking about not only finding this new evidence, but thinking about other things we've talked about in this class, like the musical traditions of, say, France and England. Mm-hmm. They were literally there's the 100 Years' War. Yeah. They were at war for 100 years.
Yeah.
Very much did not like each other.
Yeah, no.
And they're separated by a very large body of water.
Yeah.
And so even when we talk about these traditions, even in the medieval times, the same time period we're talking about, England influenced France with new concepts of harmony, the whole triad concept that they brought to France, and that's become ingrained.
Thirds and sixths, and France was ooh, I want that.
And that's the foundation of all of our harmony
that's
today.
That's what we use all the time. Right. Unless you're atonal, and then people think you're crazy, which is not true.
I know you love some Steve Reich, but
oh yeah.
So essentially, if they are separated by a large body of water and by constant war for 100 years, and their music still had such an impact on one another, how can you say that the groups of people living in the same space for 300 years, coexisting on that peninsula, even amongst one another, which we'll talk about more in future episodes, how could you say that couldn't have had an impact?
Right.
The chances are really, really high.
The odds, as JPM would say, the factorials,
there's
at least 3.
The math, and at least 3.
No, you're right. That totally makes sense. That there has to have been some overlap happening, right? Some sort of influence. That's insane.
So that's what we got for now. I'm gonna leave you with the teaser.
Cliffhanger?
The cliffhanger.
Bro.
The cliffhanger. You'll be invited back for the rest of them
okay.
because, it would just be sad if it was just me talking to myself. Absolutely not.
Aw.
I might do the dishes.
Please.
So we have set the scene for our investigation moving forward. Please join us for episode 2. We'll take a more in-depth look at what life was actually like living in medieval Iberia. I might have Moriah read some poetry. Ooh. She didn't know that until now. I'm glad your reaction was positive. Otherwise,
I love poetry.
It may not be in English. Just kidding. So we'll see you next time for episode 2 for our further investigation of al-Andalus at the intersection of music and myth.
Goodbye.